Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're doing a deep dive into the 2008 financial crisis. But we're not just looking at it as some historical tragedy. We're going to frame it as what it actually was for a select few, an absolute high-stakes financial thriller. When the global economy was completely crashing, a handful of investors executed some highly specific, brilliant strategies to not just survive, but to make staggering fortunes. And we have 6 distinct playbooks to explore.
Okay, let's dive right into this.
Here's the agenda for today's explainer. We'll be covering the ultimate contrarian bet, the Titan's calculated leverage, a masterclass in disciplined patience, the safe haven illusion, the foreclosure buying spree, and finally, the power of boring. We're going to cover the whole shebang, from complex Wall Street derivatives right down to the groceries sitting in your pantry.
All right, let's jump right into section 1, the ultimate contrarian bet. This is the story of Michael Burry's isolation and eventual triumph.
Picture this. It's the autumn of 2005. Wall Street is basically throwing giant parties to celebrate this massive, seemingly unstoppable housing boom. But Michael Burry, he was completely isolated. He's up late, poring over obscure data, and he realizes the entire system is rotting from the inside out with bad subprime loans. He knew a crash was mathematically inevitable. But that brings up a really massive question. How exactly do you bet against a booming housing market? What he found totally contradicted the major banks and rating agencies. He needed a very specific vehicle to place his bet.
So how did he actually pull this off? He used a financial instrument called a credit default swap. You can just think of it like an insurance policy. He basically convinced major Wall Street banks to let him buy these swaps. He paid them regular premiums, and in exchange, if the underlying mortgage bonds completely collapsed, the policy would pay out massive, massive profits. The banks? Well, they thought it was just free money. But Burry knew better.
But here's the thing. Being right early is often exactly the same as being wrong. For years, Burry had to sit through this agonizing wait. Through 2006, he faced downright mutiny from his furious investors. He's paying out millions in premiums while the market is still climbing. It was brutal. But then, by 2007, default rates surged. And in 2008, the market broke completely. His fund reaped hundreds of millions, and he netted a $100 million personal profit. Talk about ultimate vindication. Moving on to section 2, the Titan's calculated leverage. This is Warren Buffett stepping in amid the chaos. So while Michael Burry was shorting the market years in advance, Warren Buffett took a totally different route. He stepped right into the absolute worst of the 2008 panic. Just 2 days after Goldman Sachs was literally forced to become a bank holding company just to survive, Buffett slid them a jaw-dropping $5 billion lifeline. He was moving massive amounts of capital into the market with supreme confidence, right when everyone else was frantically running for the exits. But, Buffett didn't just hand over a blank check. He extracted some incredibly lucrative terms. We're talking special preferred shares paying a massive 10% annual dividend. He secured warrants to buy another $5 billion in stock at $115 a share. And honestly, this is my favorite detail. He actually stipulated that top Goldman executives were absolutely banned from selling their own shares before he sold his. No way around it. That is the ultimate negotiating leverage you get when the survival of the entire financial system is up in the air. This entire deal perfectly encapsulates his legendary philosophy: be greedy when others are fearful. But keep in mind, this was absolutely not a guaranteed sure thing. The total collapse of the financial system was a very real, genuine possibility. But Buffett analyzed the board, he figured the government would likely step in to prevent total ruin, and he made a highly calculated, incredibly profitable play. Okay, section 3, a masterclass in disciplined patience. Let's look at Howard Marks and Oaktree. If Buffett was the guy stepping in during the panic, Howard Marks was the guy leaning into the incredible psychological discipline it takes to just hold back. By May of 2008, his firm Oaktree had raised a massive $10.9 billion war chest. And then they just sat on it. They waited through the entire summer. It wasn't until Lehman Brothers crumbled in September and the markets entered a true, terrifying freefall that they finally unleashed their capital. They were reportedly deploying up to $75 million a single day, right at the absolute bottom. To pull that off requires a uniquely contrarian mindset. Oaktree's stellar reputation meant they could raise billions in locked-in capital from investors. And because that capital was locked in, they didn't have to face the kind of investor mutiny that Michael Burry dealt with. It perfectly set them up to buy distressed debt from panicked sellers for literally pennies on the dollar, at a time when absolutely no one else in the world was willing to lend. Now for section 4, the safe haven illusion. let's talk about the 2008 gold twist. When you think about a financial crisis, you probably assume gold is this flawless, impenetrable safe haven, right? Well, 2008 gave us a pretty shocking twist. Right in the middle of the worst financial crisis since the Great Depression, gold plummeted. It fell from over $1,000 an ounce down to just $692. It lost nearly a third of its value, totally defying its own reputation. So why did that happen? The simple answer is a liquidity crisis. Think about it. When funds are facing massive margin calls and the stock market is crashing hard, investors are forced to sell everything that isn't bolted to the floor just to raise cash. They don't sell what they want to sell, they sell what they can sell. And that forced liquidation dragged gold down right alongside the broader market in a pure panic sell-off. Patience, however, did reward the people who held on. Despite the wild volatility that year, gold actually ended 2008 slightly up on average. And by 2011, it had skyrocketed past $1,500. So the crucial takeaway here is this. Safe havens resist long-term systemic collapse, for sure, but they are absolutely not immune to short-term panic sell-offs. All right, Section 5, the foreclosure buying spree. Here is Blackstone's institutional pivot. Now, this specific playbook comes with some pretty deep moral tension, because there are two very different sides to this story. On the one hand, you have the devastating human cost. 9 million foreclosures, families displaced, entire neighborhoods bought up by anonymous corporate entities. But, mechanically speaking, it was a brilliant trade. Blackstone swooped in, bought heavily discounted homes at auction, and actually securitized the rental income to create a brand new multi-billion-dollar asset class. And they capitalized on this with a scale we never really seen before. Between 2012 and 2016, Blackstone spent $10 billion on this strategy. They even secured a $1 billion loan backed by the government entity Fannie Mae, which gave them incredibly favorable interest rates. And they utilized real estate investment trust tax exemptions to avoid federal taxes. So, setting aside the controversy for a moment, it was a perfectly executed institutional pivot that maximized the massive flood of cheap inventory.
Finally, Section 6, the power of boring. Let's look at defensive sector investing.
So far, we've talked about complex derivatives, multi-billion-dollar bailouts, and massive real estate empires. But the quietest strategy of them all proves you actually don't need a billion-dollar war chest or some inside connection at Goldman Sachs to survive a crash. I'm talking about defensive sector investing. It requires absolutely zero genius predictions. You just need an understanding of basic human necessities. During a recession, people might cancel their vacations or, hold off on buying a new car, but they don't stop buying toothpaste, they don't turn off their electricity, and they certainly don't stop buying groceries. And the concrete numbers really prove why this works. In 2008, the broad S&P 500 was just decimated, dropping 38.5%. But look at consumer staples. Companies making the things you use every single day, like Procter & Gamble, saw significantly softer impacts. And Walmart actually saw slight growth as shoppers flocked there for value. These boring bets get way less attention, but they were actually the most replicable strategy, and they'd vastly outperformed those dramatic high-risk gambles. So we've seen the contrarian risk taker, the leveraged titan, the patient debt buyer, the cautious gold investor, the massive institutional landlord, and the boring defensive strategist. Economic cycles are totally inevitable. When the next crash comes, what will your psychology dictate? Which of these 6 playbooks will you use? Thank you so much for joining me in this explainer. Keep learning, keep analyzing, and I'll see you next time.